Have you ever wondered why Russia and Ukraine have been locked in conflict for decades? Why China can challenge the United States on the world stage while countries in Central Africa remain trapped in devastating poverty? Why the Middle East sits on half the world's oil reserves yet drowns in endless wars? What makes some nations powerful and influential while others remain fragile and dependent on foreign aid? You might think the answers lie in political ideology, the quality of leaders, or perhaps natural resources. But British journalist Tim Marshall offers us a completely different answer in his extraordinary book, Prisoners of Geography, an answer that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about international politics and history. The answer, simply put, is geography. Mountains and rivers, plains and oceans, deserts and forests. These silent, immovable features of our planet are, in truth, the ones writing the history of nations, drawing the limits of their ambitions and setting the ceiling on their possibilities. Leaders come and go. Ideologies rise and collapse. Systems transform and evolve. But geography stays. It is permanent, immovable, and it imposes itself on every generation anew. We as individuals, peoples, and nations are prisoners of geography, whether we realize it or not. In this video, we are going to travel together across 10 of the most complex and fascinating regions on Earth. From frozen Russia to rising China. From the turbulent Middle East to the wounded continent of Africa. From the heart of Europe to the depths of the world's oceans. We will see how the map is truly the master key that explains everything. By the end of this journey, you will never watch the news the same way again. Let's begin our journey in the largest country on Earth by landmass, a country that spans 11 time zones and covers 1/7 of all the land on our planet, Russia. If you look at a map of Russia with an uninformed eye, you might think it sits in a remarkably comfortable position. Enormous territory, vast natural resources including oil, gas, minerals, and agricultural land, and one of the most powerful militaries in the world. But here is something most people never consider. Every czar who ruled Russia, every Soviet leader who sat in the Kremlin, and every Russian president who came after them has been haunted by the same inherited geopolitical nightmare. That nightmare is the sea. Russia, for all its colossal size, is essentially landlocked when it comes to warm, freely navigable water. Most of its northern ports, Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, freeze for months during winter, crippling both trade and military mobility. Vladivostok on the Pacific is far in the east and requires passing through straits controlled by Japan. Its Black Sea fleet must pass through the Bosphorus Strait, controlled by Turkey, just to reach the Mediterranean. This is the Russian nightmare. A permanent, suffocating sense of maritime encirclement. To understand everything Russia does on the international stage, you must keep this nightmare in mind at all times. Why did Russia annex Crimea in 2014? Because Crimea means control of the port of Sevastopol, the only warm water base for Russia's Black Sea fleet and its most strategic vital southern naval outlet. Without Crimea, that entire fleet becomes strategically crippled. Why does Russia oppose so fiercely Ukraine's potential membership in NATO? Because Ukraine means a direct border with the West, access to the Black Sea, and a strategic key that Russia cannot afford to let fall into the hands of adversaries. In other words, what we see on our television screens as political confrontation and aggression is not merely the temperament of one leader or a clash of ideologies. It is centuries of accumulated geopolitical anxiety rooted entirely in geography. The second dimension of Russia's dilemma is its land-based vulnerability. Russia, which appears by sheer size to be the most defensible country on Earth, is actually one of the most strategically exposed nations when it comes to land defense. How can that be? The answer lies in the Great European Plain, a vast flat expanse stretching from Western Europe all the way to the Ural Mountains, with virtually no significant natural barriers. This plain has been an open highway for invaders throughout history. The Mongol Empire swept in from the east across these steppes and struck a blow that scarred Russia's collective psyche for centuries. Napoleon marched from the west across those same plains and burned Moscow in 1812. Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941 across the same flat terrain, reaching the outskirts of Moscow and besieging Leningrad for nearly 3 years. These historical traumas have cemented a permanent conviction in Russia's strategic mind: there must always be a wide buffer zone between Russia and any potential enemy. This is why Russia feels a compulsive need to keep neighboring countries like Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic states within its sphere of influence. They are, from Russia's perspective, literally the shield protecting it from any Western assault. It is not expansion for the sake of empire, it is expansion for the sake of survival. But this Russian sense of encirclement collides directly with those neighboring people's desire to determine their own futures, creating a crisis that has no easy resolution because its source is not political will, but geography itself. Now let us travel to the opposite side of the world, to the rising Asian giant, China. China is a truly exceptional geopolitical case. It possesses almost everything at staggering scale: more than 1.4 billion people, a civilization stretching back thousands of years, an economy competing for the top spot globally, and the world's largest standing army by number of personnel. And yet even China, with all this greatness, cannot escape the constraints of geography. To China's west lie some of the highest mountain ranges on Earth, the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas, natural barriers so formidable that large-scale land invasion from that direction is virtually impossible. To its south lie the dense jungles and river systems of Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. To its north stretch the Gobi Desert and the vast Mongolian steppe. This sounds like an impenetrable fortress, doesn't it? And yet China has suffered its most devastating invasions precisely from those same directions. The Mongols and the Manchu breached its northern defenses and occupied its capital. Japan struck from the eastern coast and committed horrific massacres in the 20th century that China has never forgotten. China's eastern maritime frontier is today one of the most tension-filled regions on the planet. The South China Sea is among the most economically vital bodies of water on Earth. Over $5 trillion in global trade passes through it every year. Whoever controls this sea holds enormous economic and military leverage. China claims sovereignty over most of it, building artificial islands and establishing military installations, putting it in direct confrontation with the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan. Not to mention the United States, which views these moves as a fundamental threat to freedom of navigation and to its historic maritime dominance. Taiwan, the island separated from the Chinese mainland by a strait of just about 180 kilometers, is far more than a political dispute over sovereignty. For China, controlling Taiwan means breaking what strategists call the first island chain, the arc formed by Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines that currently prevents China from freely accessing the open Pacific Ocean. Without Taiwan, China remains bottled up in its eastern maritime backyard. With Taiwan, it can project power into the wider Pacific and directly challenge American naval supremacy. This is why when you hear Chinese leadership speak about Taiwan, understand that behind those words lies a geopolitical calculation centuries in the making, not merely nationalist pride. Similarly, China's massive Belt and Road Initiative, pumping hundreds of billions into roads, ports, and railways across Asia, Africa, and Europe, is not Chinese generosity. It is a sophisticated strategic attempt to secure alternative trade and energy corridors that bypass maritime choke points controlled by other naval powers. Geography is the constraint, the grand projects are the attempt to transcend it. Now let us cross to a region that barely leaves our news cycle, the Middle East. Yet most of us watch Middle Eastern news as though we're watching a drama whose internal logic escapes us entirely. The answers to so many of our questions lie, once again, in geography. Consider this: who drew the borders of Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon? In most cases, not the people who lived there. They were drawn by British and French diplomats sitting at tables in London and Paris after World War I, dividing the Ottoman inheritance with rulers and pens, with no regard whatsoever for the tribal, ethnic, or sectarian realities on the ground. The infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 drew arbitrary lines that lumped incompatible communities into the same borders and split cohesive groups across different states. Iraq, for instance, ended up containing Kurds in the north, Sunni Arabs in the center, and Shia Arabs in the south within a single state, while the Kurds found themselves fragmented across Iraq, Turkey, Syria, and Iran. What we call the instability of the Middle East is in significant part the natural expression of tensions among peoples whose borders don't reflect their actual identities and interests. It is not only religion or ancient grievances, it is the fundamental contradiction between the borders colonially drew and the borders that human and historical geography would demand. Oil adds another layer of staggering complexity. The Persian Gulf Basin holds roughly half of the world's proven oil reserves. That enormous wealth has been simultaneously a blessing and a curse. A blessing because it gave Gulf states almost unimaginable riches. A curse because it turned the region into a playground for foreign interests that have no stake in genuine lasting stability. Geography placed the oil here, history made the world unable to live without it. Politics created the endless conflicts over who controls it. One of the most thought-provoking examples in the Middle East is Iran. Iran, which the Gulf states and the West treat as a dangerous adversary, is a country surrounded on virtually every side by hostile or unstable neighbors. Afghanistan to the east, Pakistan to the northeast, Iraq to the west, Turkey and Azerbaijan to the northwest, and to the south, the Persian Gulf, hosting significant American military forces.
This geopolitical situation makes Iran feel as though it is on permanent siege, which explains the intensity of its reactions and its determination to develop capabilities that make any attack on it prohibitively costly. Geography also explains the fierce rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Both nations aspire to regional leadership. Both have existential security concerns. The sectarian divide between Saudi Sunni Islam and Iranian Shia Islam provides a deep trench that geopolitical competition fills with fuel, making it burn hotter than it otherwise would. The proxy confrontations you see playing out in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon are at their core a competition for regional influence using religious and sectarian tools as instruments. After the Middle East, let us cross to the continent that has puzzled analysts for generations, Africa. The continent that possesses natural resources sufficient to make every one of its people among the wealthiest on Earth, and yet contains half of the world's poorest nations. How can wealth of this magnitude coexist with poverty of this depth in the same place? The answer has deep geographical and historical roots. Start by looking at a map of Africa's coastline.
Afghanistan is not just a country. It is what historians call the graveyard of empires. That brutal label is not literary metaphor, it is precise description. Afghanistan's geography consists overwhelmingly of rugged, interlocking mountain ranges extending from the massive Hindu Kush range. These mountains create dozens of isolated valleys, each one a natural fortress unto itself. No flat roads, no easy communication networks, no single central point whose capture would mean control of the whole country. Any invading army can capture Kabul with relative ease, and then find itself facing hundreds of fortified valleys that know nothing of central defeat and nothing of surrender. The Soviet Union entered Afghanistan in 1979 with tanks, aircraft, and advanced weaponry. After 10 brutal years, it left with devastating losses in lives and morale. The geography was a weapon in the hands of the Mujahideen, more effective than all the Western arms they were supplied with. When a tribe sits in a valley ringed by distant mountains and knows every slope, every gully, every secret path, it becomes virtually impregnable even to the most technologically sophisticated armies. Afghanistan's deeper tragedy is that it is surrounded by regional powers that do not truly want it to be strong and stable. Pakistan fears an Afghan state aligned with India on its western border. Iran wants influence in the west of the country. Russia doesn't want an inflamed hotspot near its borders. India seeks a presence there to balance Pakistan. Weak Afghanistan became a playground for all these parties, and its people are the ones paying the price. Geography placed it at the crossroads of these powers and made its stability hostage to agreements that none of these powers genuinely want to conclude. Now, let us talk about the oceans themselves. The oceans are not merely water separating continents, they are the vital arteries of the modern global economy and the most important arenas of strategic competition on Earth. Approximately 90% of all global trade moves by sea, and this trade passes through a limited number of decisive choke points. The Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf carries 1/5 of the world's oil supply. The Strait of Malacca between Malaysia and Indonesia sees 80,000 ships per year carrying a quarter of world trade. The Suez Canal connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea saves ships from sailing around Africa entirely. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the mouth of the Red Sea handles a major portion of Gulf exports. Whoever controls these straits and passages hold the heart of the global economy in their hand. This is why the United States, whose dominance depends on free maritime commerce, keeps its massive fleets deployed near every one of these sensitive choke points. And this is the real reason behind so much American military presence in regions far from its own shores. When you look at the map of American military bases around the world, you'll find them concentrated at specific points: Japan and South Korea to anchor East Asia, the Gulf to secure oil flow, the Indian Ocean to influence routes between Asia, Africa, and Europe, Europe to guarantee Allied commitment. These deployments are not random, they are a precise reflection of the geopolitical logic that begins with geography. Now, let us pause at a region most people overlook, yet it sits at the very center of global strategic competition: the Arctic. At first glance, this might seem strange. How can a region covered in ice be a geopolitical key? The answer: climate change is slowly but steadily melting the Arctic ice, opening navigational routes that have never existed before. The Northwest Passage linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the Arctic, if fully opened, would cut thousands of kilometers off shipping routes compared to passing through the Panama Canal or around the Cape of Good Hope. The economic and military value of this is immense. Who will control these new passages?
Russia has the world's longest Arctic coastline and claims a vast economic zone extending toward the pole. Canada considers the Northwest Passage internal Canadian waters. The United States rejects this, treating it as international waters open to all. And China, despite being far from the Arctic, has declared itself a near-Arctic state and is investing in land rights and ports in Iceland and Greenland. Why? Because it understands that whoever plants its flag early in the Arctic today will occupy a strategically exceptional position later when those regions become navigable, exploitable, and potentially inhabitable. The competition for the Arctic is profound in its stakes. Beneath its ice lie an estimated 187 billion barrels of oil and approximately 27% of the world's undiscovered natural gas reserves. This is what makes it worth all this attention and why the great powers are moving quietly but decisively toward the Arctic. It is a new version of the 19th century scramble for Africa, except this time it is happening on ice. India and Pakistan. A relationship whose complexity is almost impossible to understand without returning to the map and history together. These are two nuclear-armed neighbors in a state of near-permanent hostility, 3 formal wars, and dozens of border conflicts since independence in 1947. Why does this conflict never end? Geography places India in a position of considerable natural security from the north. The Himalayan mountains form a barrier so formidable that large-scale land invasion from China is virtually impossible. But the western flank, where Pakistan lies, represents the critical gap in India's geographical armor. There is no natural barrier of sufficient magnitude between northern India and Pakistan. Every war between them has featured land axis assaults across those plains. Kashmir, the perennially inflamed flashpoint, is more than an emotional or religious dispute. It is literally a water war. Kashmir is the headwaters of the rivers that irrigate roughly a third of Pakistan's agricultural land. Whoever controls Kashmir holds the power of life and death over Pakistan's agricultural-dependent economy. That is an existential equation, not merely a border disagreement. India simultaneously faces another reality. Its central position in the Indian Ocean is a profound strategic gift. The Indian Ocean is geographically centered on India, giving it a commercial and strategic position connecting it to East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and Southeast Asia simultaneously. India is fully aware of this advantage and is actively building the naval power to reflect its pivotal position, competing quietly but determinedly with China for influence across the...
Japan and Korea and the Pacific Island nations have their own compelling geopolitical story. Japan is an island, and that single fact changes everything. Islands enjoy natural protection that no land border can match. No one has ever successfully invaded Japan from outside. The Mongols tried twice and failed, once because violent storms, which the Japanese called the divine wind, destroyed their fleets. This sense of near inviolability to land invasion gave Japan the security to build a civilization deeply oriented toward the sea, excelling in industry and commerce. But being an island means scarce natural resources. Japan lacks oil, most metals, and many of the raw materials essential for modern industry. This necessity shaped Japan into a world-class manufacturing and technology power rather than an extraction economy. But it also means Japan is deeply vulnerable to supply disruption. In World War II, the Japanese drive into Southeast Asia was motivated directly by the desperate need for petroleum, since its economic veins ran dry without it. When America cut off Japan's oil supply in 1941, the crisis reached its breaking point, and the attack on Pearl Harbor was among its direct consequences. Korea, the peninsula barely holding its ground between two giant rivals, China on one side and the American naval presence anchored in Japan on the other, found itself cut in two not by its own geography but a military line at the end of the Korean War. The Korean Peninsula is another demonstration of how political geography creates human geography that persists for generations. North and South Koreans speak the same language, share the same ancestry, yet a line drawn in 1953 has sent their lives down paths so divergent they might as well be from different worlds. Latin America is the continent that suffers from the curse of being in the backyard of the greatest power in modern history.
Everyone who has lived in Latin America knows that geography placed it close enough to the United States that dependency sometimes seems almost inevitable. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823, declaring the Americas a zone of American influence off limits to European rivalry, shaped American policy toward Latin America for 2 full centuries. Brazil, the continent's largest nation by both area and population, faces a peculiar geographical paradox. Its sheer size, which appears to be an advantage, sometimes becomes a burden. Its enormous territory, with the Amazon basin and its dense tropical rainforests, makes connecting interior regions to the coast extraordinarily expensive and complex, impeding internal economic integration. The Amazon's vast natural resources compensate for this, but they also invite environmental controversies that make rapid extraction politically contentious on the global stage. Mexico sits in a position that makes it geopolitically a neighbor of the greatest power in modern history. Its northern border with the United States, stretching 3,400 kilometers, is one of the world's most trafficked in human movement and commercial exchange. This proximity offers enormous economic opportunity, but it also means Mexico is perpetually subject to the currents of American domestic and foreign policy in ways disproportionate to its size and agency. Now, let us close with a profound idea that Tim Marshall explores in this extraordinary book. Is geography destiny or opportunity? Is it an escapable prison or merely a starting point? His answer is both simultaneously. Geography is the frame you did not choose, but what you build inside that frame remains your choice. Singapore, that tiny island with almost no natural resources, used a strategic vision, deeply aware of its own geography, to transform its position astride the Strait of Malacca from a mere transit point into a global commercial and financial hub. The Netherlands, despite its small size and limited territory, converted its maritime commercial dominance that shaped world trade for centuries. Israel, despite being surrounded by hostile neighbors and possessing narrow territory, built an economic, technological, and military power far exceeding its geographical dimensions. These examples don't mean geography is irrelevant. They mean geography determines the cards you hold, while political and strategic intelligence determines how you play them. Peoples who understand their geography don't resist it or ignore it, they invest in it and transform even its constraints into advantage.
Consider the Persian Gulf from this angle. What was geographically unremarkable in the age of camel caravans became a geopolitical treasure in the age of maritime navigation and modern energy. The geography didn't change, but technology and economics changed what the geography means. Whoever understands these shifting dynamics and reads how the world is moving can see opportunities long before others do. There is another profound lesson that most people miss. Geography governs not only nations, but cities. Why did London, Paris, New York, and Shanghai become global centers? In every case, the answer is geographical. London on the Thames, with its access to the sea. New York at the mouth of the Hudson, with a magnificent natural harbor. Shanghai at the mouth of the Yangtze River, which penetrates deep into the heart of China. Paris in the center of a river basin that made it accessible from every direction. The great cities of history were never built randomly. They grew where geography enabled meeting, exchange, and trade. Prisoners of Geography teaches us to stop seeing the world solely as a theater of personal ambitions or ideological conflicts, and to start seeing it as the natural product of the land that carries us. Mountains are not merely scenery. Rivers are not merely water.
Distances are not merely numbers. They are silent forces shaping the fates of nations and defining the boundaries of what is possible in every era and every place. And perhaps the greatest legacy of this book is that it compels us to always ask, where is this? Because the answer to that seemingly simple question usually contains the answer to every larger question that follows. The mountains will not move, the rivers will not change course, the oceans will stay where they are, but the peoples and nations that understand these realities, that build their decisions on them rather than ignoring them, are the ones who truly write history, and those who ignore geography will find in time that geography will not ignore them. We are all prisoners of geography to varying degrees, but the difference between the prisoner who lives a genuine life and the prisoner who wastes away behind the bars is awareness of the nature of the constraints and knowledge of the limits of freedom within them. Look at your own map, the map of your country, the map of your region, the map of the world you inhabit. You will find in it things no political history book will ever show you. Prisoners of Geography is not a book about despair, it is a book about clarity. And when you open your eyes to the true map of the world, you will never look at the news the same way again. Did you enjoy this journey around the world? Which region surprised you most? Do you think your own country is a prisoner of its geography? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found value in this deep dive, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you these rich knowledge journeys every week. I'll see you in the next one. Let's take a moment to go deeper on something the book handles with remarkable insight. The idea that geography doesn't just shape what nations do, it shapes how nations think. Every country develops what we might call a geographical psychology, a collective way of seeing the world that is deeply informed by the physical environment its people have inhabited for centuries. Take Russia again. The Russian people have absorbed the experience of invasion across open plains so deeply into their cultural and political DNA that even ordinary Russians, not just the Kremlin, tend to support buffer zone policies that outsiders find aggressive or irrational. When a Russian politician speaks of near abroad as a vital security interest, they are not simply repeating government propaganda. They are, in many cases, expressing a genuine anxiety that is centuries old, transmitted through folk memory, literature, and lived experience. Tolstoy wrote about it. Dostoevsky's characters breathe it. The endless flat landscape itself, which Russian writers have described with both love and dread, creates a psychology of exposure that has no equivalent in a country surrounded by mountains or water. The Chinese have their own version of this. The concept of century of humiliation, the period from mid-19th century to 1949, when China was carved up, invaded and dominated by foreign powers, is not just official Communist Party narrative, it is a deeply felt national wound. And crucially, every one of those humiliations entered China through the sea or through contested border regions. Japan came from the east by sea. Britain forced the Opium Wars through maritime power. The West imposed unequal treaties that opened China's coastal cities to foreign control. The result is a Chinese strategic psychology that is intensely focused on the coasts, on maritime control, on making sure that the vectors through which humiliation entered China can never be used against China again. This is not paranoia. It is geography processed through history, then hardened into strategic doctrine.
The British Islands produced an entirely different geographical psychology. Britain's island status created a maritime identity so fundamental that at the height of the British Empire, the Royal Navy was considered not merely a military asset, but the foundation of national identity itself. British children grew up hearing that Britannia ruled the waves as though it were a law of nature. The English Channel, barely 34 kilometers at its narrowest point, kept out the Spanish Armada, prevented Napoleon from crossing, and stopped Hitler from launching Operation Sea Lion. That narrow strip of water shaped British history so profoundly that even today, long after the empire has gone, Britain's psychological and political relationship with Europe carries traces of the island mentality, a persistent sense of separation, of being adjacent to the continent, but not quite of it, which was a significant undercurrent in the Brexit debate. The Americans have absorbed their own geographical psychology in a completely different direction. Bounded by 2 oceans and 2 non-threatening neighbors, Americans have historically tended toward a confident sense of separation from the world's conflicts. The Founding Fathers explicitly warned against entangling alliances, and they could afford to because 2 oceans made genuine military isolation feasible in a way that was simply impossible for a Germany or a Poland or a Russia. Isolationism as a political idea has always had a particular appeal in America, precisely because the geography makes it feel intuitively plausible. It takes a Pearl Harbor or a September 11th, strikes that violate that oceanic buffer, to jolt American psychology from its default sense of protected separation back into active global engagement. This is one of the most powerful insights in Tim Marshall's book. To understand any nation's foreign policy, you must first understand its geographical psychology, not just the map, but how the map has been internalized by the people who live on it. Now let us think about a dimension of geography that the book touches on, but which has become vastly more important since its publication: the geography of critical infrastructure. In the 21st century, geography has extended into new domains. The undersea cables carrying 95% of international internet traffic are physical objects laid on ocean floors at specific locations, and they are vulnerable. There are roughly 400 of these cables crisscrossing the seabeds, and their choke points are as strategic as any ocean strait. Near certain coastal nations, multiple cables converge in small geographic areas. Damaging or tapping these cables is not science fiction. It has happened and continues to happen. Russia has reportedly dispatched submarines to map cable routes. China has invested in cable-laying ships and in the companies that build and maintain undersea infrastructure. The United States, through its intelligence agencies, has reportedly tapped submarine cables as part of global surveillance. Similarly, the geography of semiconductor manufacturing has become one of the most strategically consequential geographical facts of our era. The most advanced chips in the world are manufactured almost exclusively in Taiwan, that same Taiwan we discussed earlier in the context of China's geopolitical ambitions. This is not a coincidence. It is a geographical and economic development that has now acquired massive strategic weight. If China were to take control of Taiwan, it would not only break the first island chain, it would potentially control the production of the chips that run the world's smartphones, computers, weapon systems, and communications infrastructure. The geography of technology has merged with the geography of territory in ways that would have seemed almost unimaginable even 20 years. There is also the geography of food and water, a dimension that is quietly becoming one of the most explosive geopolitical forces of the coming decades. Rivers that cross international borders are already sources of serious tension. The Nile flows through 11 countries before reaching Egypt, and Ethiopia's construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has created a crisis of extraordinary complexity. Egypt, which is essentially a strip of fertile land on either side of the Nile surrounded by desert, is existentially dependent on that river's flow. Any significant reduction threatens not just agriculture, but the basic ability of over 100 million people to survive in their current homeland. For Egypt, this is not a development dispute, it is potentially a matter of national security. The Mekong River flows from the Tibetan Plateau through China, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. China has built 11 dams on the upper Mekong, and their management of water flow has caused droughts downstream that threaten the livelihoods of tens of millions of farmers and fishermen in Southeast Asia. China controls the tap. The downstream nations have very little leverage. Geography determines whose hand is on the...
These are not distant future concerns. They are already unfolding, and they are, at their root, geographical transformations with enormous political consequences. Nations that contributed least to climate change, small island states, sub-Saharan African countries, coastal Asian nations, are in many cases the most geographically exposed to its consequences. Nations with the highest historical emissions, the industrialized West, China, Russia, are in many cases better geographically positioned to withstand the initial shocks. This disparity is not merely an ethical problem, it is a geopolitical time bomb, because it will generate waves of displacement, resource competition, and political instability that no wall or military force can ultimately contain. Tim Marshall's book was written before some of these trends became as stark as they are today,
but its fundamental insight anticipates all of them. Geography matters. Where you are placed on the Earth determines what threats you face, what resources you have access to, what neighbors you must deal with, what opportunities you can pursue. And as the Earth's physical geography itself begins to shift under the pressure of human-induced climate change, the geopolitical map will shift with it, creating new winners and losers, new choke points and new passages, new conflicts, and potentially new forms of cooperation. The final lesson of Prisoners of Geography is this: wisdom begins with humility about the forces larger than any single leader, ideology, or policy. The mountains were here before the first nation-state was born. The rivers will flow after the last empire has fallen. The oceans do not consult our treaties or our ideologies. They simply are. And the civilizations that have endured and flourished across history are those that learned to work with their geography rather than against it, that turned constraints into strategy, limitations into identity, and the accident of location into the foundation of purpose. We are all, every one of us, individuals, cities, nations, civilizations, shaped by where we stand on this earth. The question is not whether geography will influence us. It will, always and inevitably. The question is whether we will be conscious enough to understand how, strategic enough to navigate it wisely, and humble enough to stop pretending we can simply wish the map away. Open an atlas. Look at the map of your own country with new eyes. Ask yourself, what does this terrain demand of its people? What does this coastline make possible? What do these borders, and who drew them, mean for the tensions you read about in the news every day? The answers are all there, written in the land itself, waiting for anyone wise enough to read. Prisoners of Geography is ultimately not a book about the past. It is a manual for understanding the present and anticipating the future. In a world drowning in information, the ability to look at a map and ask the right questions may be one of the most powerful thinking tools available to any thoughtful person. And after everything we've covered today, I hope you feel that power a little more clearly in your own hands. Think for a moment about what it means to read the news differently after absorbing the ideas in this book. Before Prisoners of Geography, you might read a headline about tensions in the South China Sea and think geopolitical posturing, trade dispute, political theater. After this book, you read the same headline and you immediately picture the map. You see the first island chain. You understand China's need for a blue water navy. You grasp why Taiwan is not just a political symbol, but a strategic pivot. The headline hasn't changed, but your ability to understand what is actually at stake has deepened dramatically. Or you read about Russia massing troops near Ukraine's border. Before, perhaps it looks like the unpredictable behavior of an authoritarian leader. After this book, you see the flat plains of Eastern Europe, the historical memory of Napoleon and Hitler, the anxiety about NATO's eastern expansion, the desperate need for strategic depth. You may not agree with Russia's actions, and you don't have to, but understanding why those actions feel rational and even necessary from the Russian geographical perspective gives you an infinitely richer grasp of the situation than simply labeling it aggression and moving. Or you read about drought and famine in the Horn of Africa and refugee flows across the Mediterranean. Before, perhaps you understand this in purely humanitarian terms. After this book, you also see it as a geographical story. The thinning margins of survivable land, the rivers whose flows are being contested, the borders drawn by colonial powers that bear no relationship to the ethnic homelands of the people trapped behind them, and the tragic logic of people moving towards water, towards food, towards survival, as people have always moved throughout humanity. This is what Tim Marshall is offering us, not a deterministic fatalism that says geography controls everything and human agency means nothing. Rather, he is offering us a new lens, one that, when added to our other ways of understanding the world, gives us something approaching genuine comprehension of why things are the way they are. And genuine comprehension is the only honest starting point for anyone who wants to make things.
The most dangerous form of ignorance in geopolitics is the kind that doesn't know it's ignorant. The kind that sees complex, historically rooted, geographically constrained situations and reduces them to simple moral narratives of good versus evil, democracy versus authoritarianism. Decisions being made affect the lives of millions. Geography teaches us that there are almost always powerful, legitimate, historical reasons why a nation behaves as it does. And understanding those reasons is not the same as endorsing them. It is simply the minimum standard of intellectual honesty required for any serious engagement with the world. Prisoners of Geography sold millions of copies around the world, not because it flatters its readers or confirms comfortable views. It sold because it does something genuinely rare. It makes the world make more sense. It takes the bewildering chaos of international events, the wars, the standoffs, the alliances, the betrayals, the migrations, the resource competitions, and reveals beneath all of it a persistent, powerful structural logic rooted in the oldest forces of all: the land, the water, the mountains, and the plains. Read it. Study a map alongside it. Then put on the news or open a newspaper and see what you see. I promise you it will be something you have never quite seen before. That is the gift of this extraordinary book. Not answers to every question, no book can offer that, but a new way of asking the questions. And sometimes the quality of the questions we ask is exactly what separates understanding from confusion. So, the next time someone asks you why the world is the way it is, why this country is at war with that one, why this region is rich and that one is poor, why this border exists where it does, and why people are dying to cross it, you will have something to offer beyond opinion and ideology. You will have the map. And the map, as Tim Marshall so brilliantly shows us, has been trying to tell us the truth all along. We just need it to learn how to read it.